And now, if we are ready with another presenter, who is Paulius Judickas, VP of Strategic Alliances of IPv4, Chairman of BalticNOG and PC member at Net UK. And his presentation title, yeah, I can hear, it's two minutes left. Yeah, okay, so he needs 2 minutes, but I will present his presentation title. It will be the curious case of IPv4 sustaining the internet until IPv6 arrives. So 2 minutes and let's get back here again.
That's actually a nice stage. I'm happy to be here. So that's the clicker, right? Cool. Hey everyone, thank you for being here. For my keynote, I think I cannot see you at all, because of this lighting. Anyway, for my keynote, I figured I will present you something that's not talked about too often. And we're used to hearing about talks on how we should all migrate to IPv6, how IPv4 is no longer sustainable. But I figured I'll do a bit of a different angle to this. And today I'm going to talk about the curious case of IPv4 and how it's still sustaining the internet, even though we declared exhaustion and end of a protocol years ago. So yeah, the protocol itself is still a backbone of the internet. We have to be realistic about that. And more importantly, we will look into what it means for IPv6 adoption, the transfer markets, the secondary markets, and the future of the internet growth. So for those of you who knows about this, probably this won't be news. For those who doesn't, let me tell you quickly on how IP addresses become an asset as they are right now. So we have 5 organizations who's managing their respective regions. So we have APNIC for Asia Pacific, we've got RIPE-NCC for Europe and Middle East, LACNIC for Latin and Caribbean, and ARIN for North America, AFRINIC, well, the name speaks for itself, it's for Africa's region. So the IP exhaustion itself was a decade-long process. Some registries now only gives out a really small allocations of new IPv4 addresses, and it mostly comes from already reclaimed space. And AFRINIC was the last registry to officially run out of IP addresses in mid-2023. And this was the date when we actually, the date that marked the true end of, new or free IPv4 addresses. So since then, only way to receive IP addresses, IPv4 addresses for your business needs was transfers, buying IP addresses, transferring those through M&As, for example, or leasing them. There's also one more additional way to receive IP addresses, and that's through waiting lists. However, it doesn't look too sustainable if you were to ask me. So for example, if you are a member of ARIN and you request for your first allocation of IPv4 addresses, you would only receive some IPs, that's a /24, 256 IPv4 addresses in 27 months. And comparing to last year, the waiting list duration expanded by 2 months. If you're in LACNIC, you're completely out of luck. Your first allocation will only reach you in almost 5 years, meaning if you have an immediate demand for IP addresses, you won't be seeing any, for years to come. This is, again, absolutely not a sustainable model to wait for allocations. So when scarcity hit, market responded. The secondary market was formed. So this year alone, we already saw a transfers, more than 37 million IP addresses transferred in between different organizations. Inter-RIR transfers, so transfers between different registries, is now a market standard, even though a couple of years ago it was still, a comparatively slow market and slow process. And yeah, acquisitions of companies. So in the graph to the left, the pink bars shows how many IP addresses changed hands through M&As. And it just so happened that lately a lot of company acquisitions are fueled and driven by IP assets that the company owns, because IP assets are often more valuable than the company itself. It's a global liquid market with supply and demand determining where growth can happen. And if you would look to the graph on the left again, you would notice the blue bars. It's only September this year, but the transfer market itself is pushing towards 2022 level, and I'm pretty sure that by the end of the year, we will see more transfers happening in this year compared to 2021, which was an absolute record-breaking year in terms of IP transfers. Because you might remember, we were in strange times where everyone closed off and all of the businesses moved to digital. VPNs boomed, virtual offices boomed. That created a demand for IPv4 addresses in the market. So how much does it cost to acquire some IP addresses? Like I've mentioned, 2021, 2022 were crazy years. We saw prices actually, it wouldn't even fit this graph right now, because the prices skyrocketed way above $50 per IP address. Now, mid-2025, we're looking into some sort of a stabilization of the prices. This is mostly due to the increased in supply, because a lot of companies that owned IP addresses noticed that the resource is super expensive right now, and we should do something about it. We should probably sell some of our IP addresses. By the time they remembered and got their IPv4 space back, the prices crashed because the market was flooded with IP addresses. Medium-sized blocks are also narrowing in prices as sellers are carving up larger blocks to make a bit more money. And the important takeaway is simple. The demand is steady, but the urgency signal is gone. Operators doesn't really see the crisis because they can get their hands on IP addresses again, and momentum for IPv6 adoption slows down a bit more again. The data of IPv4 transfers between registries reveals another fascinating dimension about all of this. So you might notice that all of our registries suffers from net outflow of IP addresses in their region, with one exception, that's RIPE-NCC. RIPE-NCC, throughout the history, and pretty stable, they're pretty stable with this. Every single year, RIPE's inventory of IP addresses grows. And this is probably due to a couple of factors. So first of all, policy differences. RIPE is among one of the most forward-thinking registries. They have the most, attractive, I'd say, policies comparing to other registries in terms of inter-RIR transfers. Charging scheme is a big thing as well, because RIPE charges everyone equally. It's, if I'm not mistaken, 1,800 euros per year. And it doesn't even matter how many IP addresses you have within your company inventory. It could be a single /24, it could be millions of IP addresses. There's no difference to you as an end user. Comparing to other registries, for example, in Erin, the fees can go up to $250,000 per year. LACNIC is even more expensive. If I remember correctly, you can be looking into invoices of 300-something thousand per year. So yeah, RIPE clearly stands out from all of the registries. And one more reason why I know there's a lot of outflow from Erin to RIPE is because RIPE allows IP holders to maintain the legacy status of IP addresses. While a lot of companies doesn't treat it as a value of any sort, there are a lot of organizations that feels that legacy IP addresses and legacy IP addresses are being those that you were given or issued before registry was even created, holds more value and more freedom to the IP addresses. So, IPv6 versus IPv4. Let's start where we are today. So, we already covered that we officially ran out of new IP addresses years ago, even decades ago. But the internet is still mostly IPv4. In 2025, only a bit over a third users can actually connect to IPv6 only services. That means the majority of the internet is still IPv4 only. Meanwhile, we have around 20 billion devices connected to the internet at any given point. At the same time, we only have 3.1 billion IP addresses that are actively routed and announced on the internet. That means a single IPv4 address is being shared between 7 devices. So NATs and CDNs have made this possible. So even though we exhausted IP addresses, IPv4 addresses, the internet hasn't collapsed. It's simply adapted. And yeah, I want to come back to this end-to-end era, and back to the fact that, like I've mentioned, a single IPv4 is now shared between 7 devices. And that's only, possible because of NATs. It was originally created as a temporary solution, temporary workaround, and today has become the market standard. Every home router, every mobile carrier, every ISP, every enterprise firewall is essentially stretching IPv4 space as an elastic band. And this is also the point where we can say it is end of end-to-end era, where each device has must have its own unique IP address to reach the services, and servers doesn't need unique IP addresses anymore to reach the actual users. The internet didn't collapse, applications adapted, content distribution network stepped in, and again, NAT became invisible to most users. But this raises a bigger question. So if the internet survived for more than a decade in this post-end-to-end era, do we still have the same urgency as we saw before for IPv6? Or has IPv4 combined with NAT, MAPT, and other technological solutions carved itself a much, much longer future than anyone expected? The data, I have another interesting piece of data, and this is a new slide, so I'm not even sure what I'm going to talk about right now. So you're looking into United States IPv4 adoption. You might notice an interesting trend. Since mid-2019, the adoption rate pretty much stalled. It's in the same level. So why is there no further momentum to this? I would offer one explanation, at least. This is what I could think of. This is due to the fundamental change of the internet architecture. And that change from of architecture is exactly that shift away from the strictly address-based architecture. Clients no longer need to use persistent IP addresses to reach services and servers. Servers doesn't need persistent IP addresses to provide services to the customers. And address scarcity takes on an entirely different dimension when unique IP addresses are no longer needed to actually provide and cycle every single client and every distinct service. So, why IPv6 adoption is so slow? From what I'm thinking is that IPv6 doesn't really give operators an immediate benefit. It's not inherently faster. It's not inherently cheaper if you don't need to buy IPv4 addresses. And it's not even inherently more secure. And yeah, you might say, but IPv6 has IPsec tied to it. But by the end of the day, it all comes down to your own network setup. That means, again, inherently, that's basically IPv4 with bigger address space. That makes business case hard for a lot of ISPs, telcos, and major providers of services. On top of that, there is a coordination problem. So apps have to wait for ISPs, ISPs wait for content providers wait for users, and this creates this sort of a never-ending loop. Early IPv6 transition tools like 6to4 or Teredo weren't reliable, and this kind of hit IPv6 reputation whenever it needed it the most, whenever it was in early stages of adoption, and gave IPv6 a bad reputation in a sense. The biggest factor, NATs just worked too well. They extended IPv4 for far, far longer than anyone anticipated. Add CDNs, TLS, SNI on top, and suddenly IP addresses are no longer critical for delivering services. All of this took the urgency out of IPv6. We can also look into the market, like I've mentioned. The prices have stabilized. If exhaustion was really hurting us, we would see panic pricing. The prices shooting up as everyone would be trying to get their hands on IP addresses. But the opposite happened. Yeah, we noticed some spike whenever everyone jumped online, but Now, we're seeing the flat lines of prices. This price stability tells us that supply and demand found its balance. Transfers keep on flowing. Like I've showed you before, this will probably be a record year in terms of transfers. And networks keep getting by with NATs and other technical solutions, and dual stack in general. So the business perspective, IPv4 just feels good enough to keep on building on it. And that's another reason why IPv6 transition drags out. So, Paulius, when will this transition end, you might ask me? If you project the current growth trend, it's unlikely that we will reach 100% up until 2045. That means we're likely be in this dual stack world for another 2 decades. That's a long time to wait, and that's why finding sustainable IP acquisition models matters. Leasing is one of them. It gives a practical, sustainable way to manage IPv4 during this extended transition. It keeps the internet growing while we slowly and steadily transition towards IPv6. Now, whenever we saw how much, that's an old slide, by the way. Anyway, now that we saw that transition and the strange dual stack period created the pressure, the secondary markets, the price volatility in IPv4 pricing, it's useful to step back and look at how much IPv6 adoption has actually reached and progressed. And this helps us frame how long the transition might happen. On the top side of the list, we have countries like India, France, Saudi Arabia, all above 70, some of the countries are above 75% of the adoption. On the other end of the spectrum, we have countries like Lebanon, Cambodia, Syria, with well below 1%. Not even that, below 0.3% of adoption rate. That means IPv6 is basically non-existent there. And then, right in the middle of the pack, let's not look in Romania, we have Lithuania with 21.8% adoption rate for IPv6. Respectable progress, but far, far, far from the leaders. And it's a clear reminder that Europe in general is somewhat lagging behind with IPv6 adoption compared to Asia and some parts of the Americas. And this shows us 3 things. First and foremost, progress is uneven. We have countries that are racing ahead, and we have countries who are barely lagging behind. Second, IPv4 remains essential. Even in countries with 70, 60, 50% of IPv6 adoption rate, we still have millions of users still working and sitting on IPv4 protocol only. And third, the transition will take years. Even with the most optimistic trends, it's unlikely that we'll see the global adoption and universal adoption of IPv6 until late 30s or early 40s. So, yeah. And we still need solutions. We still need to find sustainable models to somehow keep on building the internet while we're still slowly transitioning towards V6. And this is exactly where leasing comes in. Leasing puts unused IPv4 space back into the market. For holders, that's a recurring revenue without losing the asset. For operators, it's a way to scale quickly without huge capital expense. Leasing effectively turns IPv4 into a renewable resource of some sort, reducing hoarding, keeping the market liquid, and of course, it has to be done responsibly. Without proper RPKI management, without proper RIR record upkeeping, geolocation, abuse management controls. But if you do it right, IP leasing bridges that gap. It keeps IPv4 sustainable while we keep on building on IPv6. I figured I'll create you a quick table to show you, the policies around the world in the registries that we mentioned, in my first slides. So first and foremost, again, like I've mentioned, RIPE and CC is one of the most forward-thinking registry, and they are the most permissive. Leasing is supported as long as everything is recorded in the RIPE database. AREN also allows leasing, but with a caveat. Leasing does not qualify as a justification to receive more IP addresses from the registry itself. On the restrictive side, we have APNIC, LACNIC, and AFRINIC. All tie IP addresses to connectivity and infrastructure. That means no pure leasing is allowed, except from one small exception in LACNIC, where legacy resources, so like we've learned, legacy is the space that predates the actual registry. So legacy resources that predates LACNIC can actually be leased in LACNIC region as well. So depending on where addresses are registered, leasing can be either straightforward, limited, or prohibited outright. The world map helps to visualize it. So we have green regions where it is allowed, yellow regions where only legacy space can be leased, and then we have violet part of the world where everything regarding leasing is prohibited outright. So the practice is not globally harmonized. Some regions treat it as illegitimate, others ban it outright. And this creates both opportunities and constraints, depending on where resources are registered and where demand comes from. To sum it up, you already saw where you can monetize some of your space, where you cannot monetize the space, but there is one interesting fact and takeaway from all of this. You can lease the IP space globally. The actual use of IP addresses is borderless. So you can list, for example, IP addresses that are coming from RIPE and use those in APNIC, for example. So that raises a thought-provoking point. IPv4 itself is a global universal resource, but the policies in the very regions struggling the most with internet growth, like Africa, parts of Asia, prohibits leasing altogether. In practice, this prevents spare space from being used and monetized and reused where those addresses could actually accelerate internet development. So the question to the community is simple. Are we limiting ourselves in regional policy silos when internet itself doesn't recognize those borders at all? And yes, leasing is a viable alternative, but it's not risk-free. The benefits, instant provisioning for the users, no capex, more IP addresses in the market, recurring revenue for the holders that has spare space. The risks include IP hijacking, risky industries, and that's why robust KYC, RDNS validation, and observability are essential. Leasing works, but only with a strong governance. This is where IPXO comes in. We launched in 2021, and our mission was to redeploy idle enterprise resources. Our solution still is to unify the ecosystem, connecting IP holders, operators, and governance in a single platform. Automation ensures speed, while compliance ensures trust. This is what keeps the market sustainable. Today, IPXO is trusted worldwide. We manage over 8 million IP addresses. We always maintain over 80% utilization for those resources. We support 400 IP holders and 1,600 IP leasees. Our know-how and certification sets us apart. Our numbers speak for themselves. For holders, the choice is simple and clear. They only have two choices, basically. Sell once or monetize continuously. Selling gives a one-time gain and probably removes all of the potential headache you might have. But you lose the ownership and miss the potential of future resource appreciation. Leasing, on the other hand, means recurring revenue, potential benefits, and yield gains. On average, monetizing for just 3 to 4 years can double the returns comparing to selling your resources outright. The IPXO platform is fully automated, simple to use, and streamlined platform. It makes monetization quick, easy, streamlined, and secure. Automation removes friction, ensuring IPv4 is reused efficiently and responsibly. KYC is central for us. Robust vetting prevents abuse. Full automation means faster provisioning, and we manage IP reputation, we manage geolocation, and we enable geolocation accuracy. We protect IP addresses against hijacking. We also maximize revenue for holders while safeguarding the internet. For leasees, the benefits are simple and clear. flexibility to scale, strong ROI compared to buying the resources, and fast access to IPs. Leasing gives them the ability to adjust network growth as IPv6 slowly rolls out. So, what's the outlook for the future? In my head, the future is pretty clear. IPv4 shortages will still persist. Supply is limited, demand is strong and growing, and the transition to IPv6 is sadly slow. Economic factors and market incentives will keep this secondary IPv4 market alive for years or potentially decades to come. IPv4 will continue to sustain the internet until IPv6 is finally ready to take over. As we close, let me leave you with this. IPv4 is far from obsolete, and don't trust anyone who tells you the otherwise. In fact, since the beginning of this year, more than 70 million IP addresses have been added to the global routing table, 72,300,000 IP addresses. That's definitely not a sign of a dying protocol. That's a proof that IPv4 is still absolutely critical and needed for the internet. More than 84% of global IPv4 pool is announced and active. Operators keep bringing more space online, and the need is definitely not slowing down. So the story is clear. IPv6 is future. Yes, no one's arguing about that. But IPv4 is still the present. And without bridging solutions, like leasing, for example, the internet wouldn't be sustainable and wouldn't be allowed to grow further. Any questions?
Thank you, Paulius. And now it's, now it's a perfect time for the questions Q&A session. We have about 10 minutes left until lunch break, so...
Or we can go to the lunch a bit earlier.
I don't know. Maybe we will have some insights, maybe thoughts, questions. I can see the hand there. Yeah.
Then I cannot see a thing.
Yeah, I know.
Hello. Maybe better if you don't see me, Andre.
Hi.
No affiliation,
Barely.
rather. Well, you said something about that, like the regional internet registries basically run out, and then the market basically kicked in.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, IP addresses are numbers. There is limited number of numbers.
Correct.
So markets cannot produce more addresses. They can only redistribute addresses that are already there. So basically they are creating a parallel structure to the distribution that was already there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm asking, where is the source? Where is the supply of these addresses? How is it possible that people only got addresses first from the regional registries, where they have to say that they need it for something because there were policies in place preventing people from hoarding addresses. And apparently they still were able to put these addresses later to a market and make money out of it, even though they received them for free in the first time. Mm-hmm. So how is this a fair and proper system?
Yeah, first of all, I completely agree with you, and we are the big supporters of Aaron's idea that leasing or even selling cannot be a justification for getting IP addresses from the registry. At the same time, all of the registries has this, at least a small safeguard with lock-in periods whenever someone receives IP addresses from the registries. So in RIPE's example, that's 24 months, whenever you cannot move any sort of IPv4 space. But there was always a speculation. If you have anything that holds at least some value, there will always be people who will decide that, well, I can benefit from it. From what I know, a lot of IP space that's being sold usually comes from either large old-school enterprises that, never actually had a use case for IPv4 addresses. So we can look into automotive, for example. There's a huge car manufacturer in the US who currently holds over 20 million of IP addresses. They haven't used a single one throughout the history since mid-80s or late 80s. At the same time, there's always brokers who are knocking on the door saying, hey, did you know that you have $1 billion worth of an asset? If you sell it, you can make $1 billion. So at IPXO, for example, we never did a single sale or purchase of IP addresses. We believe that if you receive those IP addresses, just like you've mentioned, you showed an intent to use them. It could be, next year, 5 years from now, but you will actually have an actual use case for the addresses. So that's why we're big supporters of retaining the ownership, putting IP addresses back into the ecosystem and allowing others to grow. Maybe they don't have enough capex to buy IP addresses outright, but the demand, they still have demand from their network.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I would just only say that, yeah, it was always, and always has been the case, it's always so possible that if you change your plans, you can also return the addresses to the registry and make the primary registry distribute them again. So they are still there. It's not like only market is there.
True. Actually, I have a question. If you know the answer, or maybe Marco can help you.
That's interesting.
How many IP addresses do LIRs return to RIPE, for example, every year? Just out of curiosity.
I don't have this number in my head, but yeah, basically you can see the waiting list, and you can see how often the waiting list gets used. So somebody gets 256 addresses out of it, and the only source RIPE and CC has is basically returned addresses, though not all of them are returned voluntarily.
It's mostly due to bankruptcies, missed fees, right?
Could be, or actually a fraud.
Oh, okay, okay, noted. I think Marco has something to say.
Another question there.
Yes, Marco Schmidt, also RIPE and CC manager registration services. About your question, how much IP addresses are being returned, indeed, a significant
voluntary
returned, exactly, because there's a significant amount of involuntary ones, because of the bill, we take it back. We do have occasionally people giving it back voluntary, but I think it's in the 5 digits amounts of IPv4, so let's say 50,000.
Tens of thousands, basically.
Yeah, tens of thousands per year, yes.
Okay, well, I'm still surprised. Okay, thank you.
Nice discussions. Maybe some more questions we have here? Okay, I can see the hand here, yeah.
Thank you. Mara again. I'm not paid to ask questions. I was just joking. I'm also the only person that keeps you away from your lunch, so I'll try to be short. So
Thank you, Mara.
You're welcome. So we all speak about returning the IPv4 addresses. What about the compromised IPv4 addresses? Nobody pays attention to them. Nobody wants to, use the ones that were being remanipulated. What's the cleanup process that happens regarding the IPv4 addresses that were compromised, used by darknet, right? We have 6% of whole internet being darknet, right?
Yeah.
What do we do with those IPv addresses?
Very good question. So most of those compromised IP addresses are usually victims of IP hijacking, because I doubt that there is a company in the world that would be willing to risk their reputation, where their IP space is publicly used for malicious activities. By the end of the day, it's always a responsibility of an actual owner of IP addresses. So the LIR who got that allocation. There is slight problem and slight, disconnect from the, I'd say, security measures that are currently implemented. So RPKI being one of those, with IP addresses that, is still legacy or doesn't have RPKI enabled to them at all, meaning those could be hijacked easily. Actually, so there was recently a case with Texas Instruments IP addresses, if I remember correctly. Their full /16, so class B of IP addresses, was hijacked and used for exactly this, malicious intent, spam, phishing, you name it. I'm not sure if it was ever mentioned in the darknet, actually. But in any case, the responsibility falls to actual IP owner or company LIR that was allocated that space. Managing IP reputation, so managing IP abuse, it's not an easy job. It's a proactive, it needs, it's not a one-time process to begin with. It's a continuous work where you must have a team or at least a technical stack that is always monitoring your space. So things like dark web appearances, phishing, botnet attacks, again, it falls down to the actual owner. Should there be precautions if they're not not managing their space safely and efficiently? I'd say yes. Because by the end of the day, that maliciously used space is hurting all of us and hurting the internet ecosystem in general.
Thank you. And just as we encourage people to return the IPv4 addresses they are not using, right? How do we encourage those companies that are using IPv4 in a malicious way to, use them in a better way?
Fine and
Forcefully.
penalize.
Forcefully.
With force and penalties, I'd say.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Maybe we have some left. Yeah, there. And it will be the final one.
Paulius, Veronica
Victor.
from UK IPv6 Council. So
Yeah.
we'll be talking about V6 in our panel tomorrow afternoon. And I know it's your job to sell IPv4. And so you have really poked me with the slow adoption of IPv6 and the reasons. But we will, first of all, the reason why we call v4 obsolete in our IPv6 community is not because it's not being used. It's just because nothing new is being developed for IPv4. If you look at the IETF, everything is focused on IPv6. When was the new feature, new RFC defined for IPv4? Nobody remembers anymore, right? So that's the reason for obsolete. The connectivity with IPv4 is absolutely essential, okay? Second thing is point to Mara. It's not just criminal activities or criminals abusing IPv4, it's your geolocation. So even the fact that you are transferring leasing IP addresses from another region, from another company, might impact your users and services they can access. I have helped a couple of companies in the UK to actually sort this out with major hyperscalers because the users from the UK were using US-based addresses and could not access services in the UK. Right? So you need to work with a trustworthy partner like IPXO, so here's my plug for you. But just this is not just the criminals, it's just the normal business, geolocation, absolutely essential.
Yeah, actually, really good point about all of the new RFPs being IPv6 only. Like, immediately I got an example in my head. We don't create technology for coal-fueled furnaces anymore. Same thing, we don't create new technology for IPv4. That's, I don't want to say it's an ancient technology, but it's, something that's present, but probably not in the future, or at least not dominant in the future.
Okay, and it was very productive Q&A session. Thank you.
It was.
Both. Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank you for the
everyone.
questions. Thank you once again, Paulius.